For the last thing today, we're going to cover functions. So these allow you to carry out simple tasks multiple times, or complicated tasks potentially, and it reduces the amount of code you write. So if you're doing the same thing multiple times, you don't want to have to write that code multiple times. It also reduces mistakes and makes sure that the thing that you're doing is being done the same way every time. It also makes your code easier to read because you're reducing the number of lines of code to do the same thing. So the syntax for a function is you type def, so def, and then a space. So you're defining a function. You then type the name of the function. You can call it whatever you want. This is just another object in your namespace. And then potentially it doesn't have to have any arguments. So I'm going to add one here. And so this is a good example because the function doesn't have to have any arguments. It can just do something without needing any more information than just the name of the function. So this is about the simplest function you could write. So the name of the function is say hello. It has no arguments, and then there's a colon, and then on the next line you have to indent. This is part of the syntax of Python. There must be a tab or four spaces or whatever you define as your indentation, and then whatever you want to do in the function. In this case, we're just going to print the statement hello world, and then that's it. And so when we execute the function, now we've defined it. We have to hit, in our notebook, we have to hit Shift Enter, so that's now been stored. And then in the next line, we can call the function. We just type the name of the function it has to have these parentheses after it, even though there's nothing inside them, and it will execute the function, which is just to run this one command that prints hello world. So we could have a slightly more complicated function which does have an argument. In this case, we're going to define a function print a string, and we're going to pass some string to it. We don't have to call this string. We could call this S or W or whatever. I'm just calling it string, and then when we run this command, we're going to do print %s, and then we're using this. Again, this is using this string formatter notation, and then string is the name of the variable that we're going to print. So we define that function, and then we can say print a string, and it will print whatever we just wrote. Now, Python will just as easily accept a variable when we call this function instead of the string itself. It will print, basically it'll try to print whatever we stick in there. So we can do that. We can also do y equals a number here, and then we can say print. And remember, you can use tab notation. So I can type tab, and it will bring up this drop-down menu that gives me some choices. So this is what I want, and I can say I want to print a string y. Even though this is actually an integer, I'm just printing it, so it doesn't have to be a string. It can be anything. It'll print it. It'll try to print it. And then you can have multiple arguments. So I can say print two things, and I can pass. I'm calling them 1 and 2, and then it will print these two things. And now I'm going to define x as yes and y as 10, and it will print those two things, with and between them. I can also have use this notation where there's an asterisk followed by the name of a variable, and it will allow me to expand this as like an array or a list of values. And so then when I print these three values, I can just grab them from this star blob thing that I made. And if I tried to print a fourth thing, it's going to give me an error because it says there's too many values to unpack. Here I'm unpacking blob, and it's expecting three things. So there's ways around this, but the way that it's written, it has to have three arguments.
Could you go back up to line 55?
Mm-hmm.
Or that two things.
So are you executing the notebook in the order that we're doing? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's also, we can do addition. So assuming we supply numbers, it will be able to add numbers. This is kind of a cool example because it shows you how the types in Python are dynamic, which is to say we can make a function that will take this thing plus this thing, and if it's numerical values, it will add them, but if it's something else, it might do whatever plus sign does with that. So here we define the function. We're going to add two things. We're going to add 10 and 5, so that gives us 15. So it's going to print 10 plus 5. Here we're going to add two things. It's going to print 1.3 plus 4.4. Here we're going to add in quotes, but these aren't actually numbers, these are strings. So when we add strings, we actually concatenate them. Because strings, when you take two strings and you put a plus sign between them, it doesn't do mathematical addition, it does concatenation. So Python, it doesn't matter, I can use the same function to do these two very different things. Now in practice, you probably wouldn't want to be using a function this way because it has unintended results, right? If you were adding two numbers and you didn't supply a number, you'd want it to probably give an error message and not try to concatenate. But this is showing that Python is a bit flexible in how it operates with different data types. Finally, a function doesn't just have to. So here we're printing things. We can also store things, but if we were to store values, we wouldn't maintain those after the function is run. So you have to return the values if you want to do something with them later on. So here we can we're going to combine three things with commas. I'm going to use this notation here again. So we just define this function, and so instead of typing print, we're just typing return. So we're going to return a string, which is variable 1, comma variable 2, comma variable 3. So here this will just return it, and it'll just print it. So it's not actually printing in the sense of it's not a print command, because if it were a print command, it wouldn't have these quotes here. So it's just returning the value of this string. But if we actually want to save that value and do something with it, we just add this assignment operator at the beginning. So we say x equals this function run on these three variables. So what this is saying is x will take the value of the output of this function. So we're going to execute this function and store it as x. And so x now has the value 44, 55, 66. And we can do the same thing with add 2. So yes, because add 2 is, it doesn't have a return, but it will print. It will give us the same. In this case, it will give us the same output. It will print, and we can store that. We can, and also, let's do this. Interesting. Have to come back to that. Okay. We can return multiple things. So here we're going to take two things and we're going to add them, multiply them, and raise one to the power of the other. So I called this function sum product exponent. And so we're going to have a sum, a product, and the exponent, and we're going to return 3 values. So we've got 2 and 5. So 2 plus 5 is 7. 2 times 5 is 10. And 2 to the 5th power is 32. So that's, and it's going to return, it's just going to return these 3 things. And it's going to, because there's multiple things that it's returning, it's going to create a tuple. This is like a list, but it's not a list, it's a tuple. That's different from a list in that it's immutable. So we can't change it like we can a list. But one thing we can do with this, instead of outputting it this way, we can then specify the value for my sum, my product, and my exponent. So it will unpack this tuple in order so that when we execute this command, then the values are saved in order. So the sum is 7, the product is 10, and the exponent is 32. So this is the way that you return values from a function, and the way that you pass variables into a function. And this allows you to specify this function at the beginning of your code, for example, and then use the function repeatedly in your code, and to sort of not have to type something over and over again. Are there questions about that? If not, that's the end of today's lesson, and I'll stick around for additional questions.